Well, howdy, folks. This is Scuttlebutt with the Phill. So, if any of you, ladies, gentlemen, extraterrestrials, hobbits, and cryptids, are tuning in here, you'll be tuning into our next episode with the topic of Arthurian Legends. So, okay, I'm wondering how many people have heard of Arthurian Legends. This is the stories of King Arthur and, the Round Table, the Grail Quest, and things of that nature. It's honestly one of my favorite topics to discuss in the realm of sort of medieval literature, as well as, a lot of fantasy kind of explores some elements of it. It's manifested in several different fantasy properties that many of you are currently familiar with. And I think that alone is kind of notable. But even beyond this, um, I'm looking forward to diving in to this subject. But just keep in mind, next week we'll be exploring Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I'll be hopefully having at least one or two guests on for that. And then the show after that we'll be doing is going to be sort of a state of the channel, how we're doing, and where we're going after, and kind of setting up where the channel will be come 2025. And on top of that, we'll also be the week after that, which will be the final week of the whole thing, will be sort of my first semester in an MFA program, which is more of a vlog style video. So, I mean, even if it isn't something that you may find particularly interesting, I think you would still kind of be interested in just seeing how things go in a program like that, if nothing else. So I'd still recommend you tune in for that. We'll try to have a couple of other guests on for that as well. We're going to try to take advantage of the SDSU Digital Humanities Center for that. Unfortunately, for the specific room we want to use, it's going to be limited to like 4 people. So it'll probably be myself and at least 3 others. My friend Ben might be someone I invite, as well as 2 other people from our MFA cohort. So, yeah, either way, I'm looking forward to seeing, what everyone thinks of that episode. And we're going to try to go a little bit longer for that one when the time comes. But either way, I think we'll go ahead and dive right into it. This episode is going to be a little bit shorter than usual, probably more in line with at least 30 minutes instead of our usual, like, trying to go for about an hour. So keep that in mind. I have a train trip to catch in a little while, and I want to make sure I can get there on time. So that's partly the motivation behind trying to, get out of here on somewhat of a good, time frame. But anyway, let's start. So Arthurian legends go back quite a while. One of the books I currently have right here is Le Morte d'Arthur, and I think that's by Sir Thomas Malory, and it kind of gives a sort of a broad exploration of the Arthurian legend, and I think it's very, very informative into how the style of the period kind of presented itself, and I think it gives you all the main hallmarks: the exploration of Merlin, King Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, pretty much every character, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And I do recommend that you check it out. But beyond this, I would love to hear if anyone has specific Arthurian films that have come out as late, or even maybe something that you may have grown up with when you were something you may have grown up with at a younger age that's kind of stuck with you, that's kind of tangentially Arthurian. For me, there was a movie that came out. I forget exactly who the star is, but I'm sure someone will probably let me know. But they call it, I believe it's like a Yankee or something. I forget what is it. I swear I looked this up before I started it. Because it was very influential on a lot of my writing early on, partly inspiring some of my interest in fiction. It's like a Yankee in King Arthur's court or something to that effect. And it was in the 90s, and it was something that I thought was interesting at the time and even now. And I don't know, something about it was kind of weird and sort of unique. And that kind of stuck with me. And I don't know why, but for whatever reason, it did. And, because you have like this teenage um, baseball player goes back to the King Arthur days, and he's kind of having to adjust to the time. And yeah, I don't know. I do recommend it. So if anyone can kind of point anyone in the right direction, please do. But beyond that, sort of the historical context, I think, is King Arthur was developed at a point where you had a lot of this discussion behind the Anglo Saxons and what would later become Britons. And there's a lot of elements that kind of borrow from Celtic mythology and other historical figures at the time. I think some people, there's kind of a discrepancy on who the real King Arthur might have been. Some people suggest he might have been like a post-Roman British warlord, and others still kind of are a little uncertain what exactly he actually was. If it was just maybe a story that was told, or something to that effect. And ultimately, we may never actually know the answer. But within the context itself, I mean, I think we know quite a bit literary or in the literary world about um, the King Arthur legend and how it reaches down to basically every single element that we have today, in terms of like the monomyth and the exploration of the hero's journey, sort of the call to adventure, sort of the adventure itself, and then sort of coming back to a changed home and sort of adapting to the new paradigm, the new status quo. And something about that, I think, is pretty much always going to be integral to storytelling. I mean, there's a reason I think Joseph Campbell wrote about it in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, because I mean, it's so ubiquitous, this idea that we have a hero that's thrust into a situation, goes into the situation, and then tries to um, get rid of whatever antagonistic force is like harming or affecting the land. And then by the time they return, they've helped create this new paradigm where things are more just and more conducive to a productive environment where everyone isn't under the boot of some oppressor. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, especially even regardless of where anyone sits on the political spectrum. It's pretty much kind of a universal. I mean, I don't think most people enjoy any aspect of tyranny or oppression. So I think that's kind of what I take from it most of the time. But there was a point where I was trying to develop my own interpretation of the King Arthur legend, and I kind of came into this idea, and going back to something that's a little bit more recent, is this. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but in I think 2019 or so, there was a film released called The Green Knight and starred Dev Patel as Sir Gawain. And for whatever reason, that movie really stuck with me. I don't know what it was. I think it had to do with anything from the production design to the historical sort of I wouldn't call it accuracy, but I would definitely call it like historical attention. Even though it may not have been period accurate, it still felt like it was something of the era that the film may have been set. And I mean, the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is, something that's kind of ubiquitous in terms of stories that are taught in British literature courses. And when I took a British lit class, I think in the late 2010s, the professor that was teaching us was telling us all these sort of background information. And I think she even had us read an old English rendition of the tale and kind of compare that with the modern translations and kind of see how these stories evolve over time and how certain meanings change with time. And I think I'd recommend that for anybody who's out there and really interested in sort of diving into some of the larger nuances behind certain stories and thematic elements. But yeah, the Green Knight, for some reason, I think is an interesting exploration of the idea of chivalry, or the idea of the knight's code. And in that story, I mean, you have Sir Gawain, who is essentially learning how to be a good knight. And throughout the story, he kind of doesn't. He kind of has to evolve into this character that is righteous and upstanding. And unfortunately, he's sort of brash and like hard-headed. But by the end of the story, he realizes that, going back to the very beginning, he challenges the Green Knight, who kind of is like this sort of tree sort of character, and sort of like an int, but not really. But yeah, he basically goes in to the council round table and then offers a challenge, and then Sir Gawain takes out the challenge and basically chops the Green Knight's head off, and the Green Knight kind of picks up his head off the ground and then says, 1 year hence, that the wager is going to be that basically if you chop his head off, he'll chop your head off, and you have to wait 1 year so that hopefully you've learned all these different traits and how it is to be chivalrous. And then a year passes, he goes on an adventure, and then finally meets up with the Green Knight again. And then the Green Knight basically comes up to him, and in the movie, Sir Gawain glimpses the future, and he sees that because he will basically prove himself to not be worthy, because he doesn't have the honor of essentially being a man in the scenario. He has this girdle, or this like belt, and essentially he has this belt to sort of blanket his manhood. And so because he doesn't have the strength or the bravery to take the situation like a man, he becomes a bad king, and he basically rules in such a way that the people start to revolt against him and essentially take the kingdom over and overthrow him. And having glimpsed that future, he realizes that he doesn't want that future, and essentially decides to take the girdle off and then just accept his fate. And then in so doing, the Green Knight sees that he has proven himself to be worthy of not only being called a knight, but even worthy of the future possibility that he will serve as king of of Avalon and the entire Camelot and everything. And so something about that kind of speaks to me. I don't know what it is. Sort of this idea of courage, bravery, and the idea of just being chivalrous, even beyond just what's been discussed about modern feminism, and how there's a perception that all masculinity is toxic. And I obviously disagree with this notion. I believe that masculinity can have positive aspects, and I believe that depending on what stories you read from the pantheon of Arthurian legends, you can definitely pull positive masculine traits out of each, and you can put these forward as ideas that you can implement in your own life to become a better man. And I think that today is more necessary than not, because I mean, ultimately, like half the people on the planet are men, and half of the people on Earth who are men should do everything they can to be better men. And I think that, we can get into sort of like the larger context of what a knight really did serve the purpose, or what's the knight, what purpose the knights actually served. But ultimately, I don't think there's any chivalrous trait that I would walk away from. I think chivalry is a pretty respectable position, as long as it doesn't overtly um, come at the cost of female autonomy. I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. I think that you can do one and the other at the same time without having too much of an issue. And I know some might disagree with this, but that's my feeling on it. And that's probably why I gravitate towards a lot of these Arthurian legends, because ultimately, Arthurian legends are not only about how it is to be a man, but they're also about how to be an individual. They're also about how to be an agent of your own change and how to be someone with agency. And I think that today, more than anything else, I mean, there's nothing wrong with, committing yourself to protecting your community. I don't think it's actually that, incorrect to say that we as people are incapable of the capacity for individual self-preservation on top of believing in the support of the community and doing our best to support whatever community we come from. And I think that these are going to be elements that are going to filter through in my own writing as we explore my own work more thoroughly next year. So with that, yeah, we kind of went off on the Green Knight a little bit, but I think it's worth it. But beyond this, I mean, the general arc of the King Arthur narrative is essentially, the story of a chosen one, which as a trope, I'm not that big of a fan of, but I think I'm able to let it go strictly because I feel like that element sort of adds more of a thrust as a story. Whereas if you don't do that, it can kind of feel a little more, I don't want to say distancing, but it kind of creates this effect where the person is a little like they kind of came into the story at random and they have no special place within it. And I feel like that can sometimes be detrimental, although I don't believe it's always detrimental. I believe that it does work for certain specific stories. I believe it works here since he's supposed to be the once and future king. If he was just a normal person, I don't know how that would actually work as much, but I'm sure someone's probably figured it out by now. But beyond that, I mean, the King Arthur narrative has been sort of retold in science fiction and fantasy. I believe that T.H. White's The Once and Future King sort of explores this, this sort of fantasy retelling, and it's that's actually a story that I think had some influence on Star Wars. And then Arthur C. Clarke's The City and the Stars, that also has sort of a futuristic Arthurian theme. And then I guess there's a comic named Camelot 3000, which is a sci-fi comic where Arthur and his knights are reincarnated in the future. That sounds interesting. But also horror elements. I mean, we kind of went over a little bit with the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where Gawain chops off the head of the Green Knight. So, I mean, it's pretty horrifying and visually pretty arresting. But, I mean, there's a lot of elements. I mean, you have the treachery of Mordred. You have the curse of the Holy Grail. You also have the eerie mystique of Avalon itself. And then you have had horror adaptations of the story. I mean, I think there's a movie called Excalibur in 1981 that kind of goes into it. I have not seen that, but we can kind of explore that in another video maybe next year. I think that'd be a good topic. Horror and fantasy, mixing the two together. What do you get when we hybridize genres, and what comes out of that? I think that could definitely be a good topic for next year. But I mean, beyond that, I think there's been modern reinterpretations of the female characters, like Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay, and Lady of the Lake. And I feel like even at the time, I don't think the portrayals of many of these characters are portrayed too negatively. I mean, one of them is kind of a villain, but even then, I don't think having a female villain necessarily takes away from a feminist message necessarily. Essentially, you're saying women can be anything. So, I mean, that's actually empowering. So, I mean, I don't see how that would be something negative. Because painting any one group or people as almost always 100% in the right is kind of not how life works, or not how the civilization we've built works. So I would say that probably wouldn't be as effective as a narrative thrust as others would probably presume them to be. But either way, Arthurian legends kind of pop up throughout pop culture. Literally, Monty Python and the Holy Grail is a parody of the story, and as I already mentioned, the Green Knight. And I haven't seen it, but there's a TV show that was airing not long ago, I don't think, at least within the last 10, 15 years, Merlin. But if anybody's seen that, please let me know. I'd like to see if it's worth watching and checking out. So we can kind of go off of sort of the broad strokes a little bit. So the hero's journey is sort of this idea that every single story that we've told, time and time again for thousands of years, kind of comes back to this kind of similar narrative structure. And the King Arthur's rise, fall, and then his legacy. We can kind of see elements of that within, your Star Wars or Dune even, although Dune is a little more of a critique on the idea of a chosen one or someone who's sort of a messiah. And I think it's pretty well done when it's done that way. I'm kind of curious to see how other people would like to interpret the King Arthur legend in the future. Speaking of the future, I think the future of the Arthurian media or mythos could basically be anything now. I mean, I think the genre has been opened up to such a level where you can have fantasy story that's kind of a mix with fantasy and science fiction, fantasy and horror, and maybe possibly mixing all three together, and you can have something that's very unique and different. I could even imagine some people doing a interpretation of the futuristic Camelot with Arthur leading a colony on Mars, or even wielding a cybernetic Excalibur. I mean, I think the options are endless, but for me, I guess I would pose a larger question to the audience. What's your favorite Arthurian retelling or adaptation? And how do you think Arthurian legends could be reinvented for the future? I mean, I think the opportunity today is even more exciting considering the rise of things like AI, text to speak, or text to image, or pretty much anything. I think the sky is the limit now. I think that creativity will be aided by it. I'm not against AI as a principle. I think we should not turn our backs on technology or scientific innovation, although I do think we do need to do our best to ensure that none of this technological progress ends up shortchanging the human that will probably end up being given the short end of that stick. And so I'll always come out on the human support side of things if I can. But yeah, I mean, I think the Arthurian legends won't go anywhere. We've been telling them now for hundreds of years. I think we'll be telling them for hundreds of years yet. So, yeah, it's not going anywhere. Beyond that, I can't really, say much else other than please let me know what your favorites are so I can check them out. I would like to have more options in my quiver for next year when I dive back into Fantasy Month for 2025. We'll probably be doing that again in the month of November. I think the month of November is the perfect month for fantasy, strictly because it's kind of like right before Christmas and New Year's, and then right after Thanksgiving. One moment, please. Oh, sorry about that. I had to sneeze. But anyway, as you can probably tell, I'm definitely of the opinion that you can use the genre as it's been sort of developed over the past few years, and I think go anywhere with it. I think you can take it to, as I mentioned, Mars or even more wackier places. Not that space is wacky or anything. It's just not as common to see portrayed in science fiction media as well as fantasy or horror. But there's even an opportunity to sort of dive into gender bent Arthurs if you wanted to. There's a couple of examples that have been given to me that could possibly be interesting options to explore for some. But yeah, Arthurian legends are replete through history, and I actually want to see more films like The Green Knight come out, more independent horror, uh, fantasy horrors, and I think those would be where the stories should go in general. I mean, I'm not opposed to science fiction fantasies that kind of couch themselves in Arthurian legends either, but I know there's a lot of video games that kind of explore Arthurian legends, and I haven't played them myself, but I'm curious to see if anyone else here has. Um, when it comes to sort of the idea of, I don't know what you would say, but I would say something to the effect of, if a King Arthur story works for you, do you tend to see yourself in the Arthur role, or do you see someone separately from you in that role? I think that's also an interesting question to ask and consider. And then I kind of want to throw it out in the open. Who's the best Arthurian character and why? And then beyond that, do you think Merlin would make a good AI in a sci-fi setting? I actually think yes. But beyond that, like I said, I think this episode of Scuttlebutt with Phill is going to be more on the shorter end anyway. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be wrapping up Fantasy Month next week. And I'm hoping to have at least one or two guests on to explore some of the topics we have um, sort of planned for that. And yeah, we only have a handful of episodes left right now. We have Avatar: Last Airbender, State of the Channel, and my first semester in an MFA program. And the absolute last episode will be my 2024 finale, which will be an open discussion, and that'll be on December 13th. And then after that, we'll go off air for about a month, a little less than a month. And we'll be rebranding the channel, and we will be rebranding the channel something that'll be a little bit surprising, but not too surprising, I think. I think the new direction for the channel will be something I think you'll all appreciate, and I think that it isn't really that far off from what the channel is now. It's just going to be a lot more. It's going to be a lot more broader than it is today, and we'll still be exploring the worlds of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and we'll still be diving into different worlds, their world building, and the vibes we get from them. And I would insist that you join us for the new year, and I would also suggest that you keep in touch with us on the social medias. I have all of the social media that I'm currently associated with hanging out on the YouTube bio, so definitely don't be shy. Reach out, and we can discuss these things further. But without further ado, I think I need to pay the bills real fast before we sign off. and time. So, Scuttlebutt with Phill on the Fleet Admiral Levi channel is brought to you by Vega Aerospace. Vega Aerospace. In space. No one can hear you. So, with that, I will say it is very important to say don't panic, as well as don't forget your towel. But until next time, so long, and thanks for all the fish, guys.